are you trying to accomplish in this country? What are your clear military objectives, okay? Second is you must adapt to the battlefield, okay? Because all your best plans will change over the course of the battle, okay? So the adversary that is most willing to adapt to the battlefield will win, okay? The third thing is the will to fight. So if you want to look at a war and who's most likely to win the war, you ask these three questions. One, does this guy have clear military objectives that everyone understands? Because that will determine strategy, okay? Second is this guy adapting to the battlefield? And the third is this guy, does this guy still have the will to fight? If the answer is yes to all three questions, then the person will most likely win the war. Okay, and if you look at the Vietnam War, even though America was killing a lot of people, it killed 3 million Vietnamese during the course of the war. It was not destroying the enemy's will to fight. In fact, it was making them angrier. And therefore, more people were willing to fight the Americans. Okay? So very early on, the American political leadership knew the war could not be won. So then the question then is, why did America stay in the war? And the answer is credibility. Okay? Credibility just means they didn't want to lose face. They didn't want to be laughed at by the Chinese and by the Soviets and by the Europeans, okay? But there's actually another way to understand credibility, and it's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. Okay? Have you guys heard of the sunk cost fallacy? Okay, and the idea is never ever go into a casino. The reason why is that when you go into a casino and you start losing money, at some point you cannot leave the casino. Why not?
You feel like you lost so much, so now you have to make it back.
Exactly. You want to reclaim the money you've lost, okay? You've invested so much that you cannot leave. You have to get that money back. And that's the problem with war. Eventually, you've invested so much, you cannot leave the war. And that's what happened in Vietnam. America invested so much, it didn't want to leave the war because it did not want to admit that all this has been lost. Okay? It's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. And that's why, even though America could not win the war, it still wanted to fight the war. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So the Vietnam War is another example, okay, that is similar to this, where America invests enough soldiers that it refuses to leave the war and admit defeat, okay? Does it make sense, guys? All right. Now, let's look at one more example. And this is the most recent example, and it's the Russian-Ukraine war. Now, as you know, in February 2022, Putin ordered a special military operation against Ukraine. Okay? And this is Ukraine. And Russia attacked from three axes. Okay? The north to take Kyiv, the capital. You have the east to take Donetsk. And then you have the south from Crimea to take the south. Okay? And as we know, the north failed. Okay? The north attack failed, and the Russians had to turn back. But the east and the south were successful, okay? Now, let's think about this. You have an extremely powerful military attacking your country, the Ukraine. If you were the Ukrainian president, if you were the Ukrainian military, there's really only one way you can fight this war and win. And what is it? Using traditional military doctrine. How much you fight this war? You guys know? Let's go back to mass forces, avoid encirclement, protect supply lines. How much you fight this war? There's only one way you can fight this war. Excuse me? How do you disrupt supply lines? There's only one way you can fight this war and win. And what is it? The enemy is attacking you, right? So what must you do? Okay, the answer is you must retreat. Okay? Why? The enemy is attacking, right? So you pull back your forces. Why would you do that? What's the logic of that?
Because then they have longer supply.
Exactly, okay? It's that simple, okay? You want to overextend your enemy. Ukraine is a huge country, right? And Russia didn't send out that many soldiers, maybe 160,000. That's not that many soldiers. So if you just give them space, they're going to outrun the supply lines, okay? And then when they outrun the supply lines, you can encircle them and you can disrupt their supply. And that's the only way you can win the war, okay? What did the Ukrainians do instead? That's the only way to win this war. But what did the Ukrainians do instead, which made them lose the war? Yeah, so the Ukrainians refused to give up space, okay? They refused to give up land. They want to fight the Russians for every inch of territory. And eventually, because the Russians had more forces, mass forces, they were able to push through, okay? So that's the first major mistake that Ukraine made. But then last summer, Ukraine launched something called a counteroffensive, right? So once Russia was able to take space, because Russia is a land army, it started to develop fortifications, defenses, okay? Mainly artillery. And that 3 lines of defenses. And in the summer offensive, the Ukrainian military, for whatever reason, sent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers against this artillery, and the Russians blew everyone up, okay? Now, here's a question. Why are the Ukrainians doing this? They've lost the war now, right? They have no more soldiers. Right now, the average age of the Ukrainian army is it's over 40 years old. They have guys in their 60s and 70s fighting in the military. They don't have enough manpower. The war is lost. Why would the Ukrainians do this? First of all, why would they fight for every inch of territory? And why would they launch a counteroffensive against a superior enemy? What's the problem? Okay, the first is their president, Zelensky, the guy's a TV actor, okay? Which means that he doesn't think strategy, he just thinks what looks good on TV. So for the first 2 years of the war, we're watching this on TV, right? And it looked as though the Ukrainians were going to win this war, right? I remember like 2 years ago, people were saying that the Ukrainians are going to march to Moscow and overthrow Putin. People were saying that, okay? And the reason why is that Zelensky is a master of public image manipulation, okay? He was distorting reality for people through television. The problem with that, though, is it's not reality, guys, okay? The reality on the ground is very different from TV, okay? So who else is like Zelensky in this world? Trump is exactly like Zelensky, okay? Do you understand? Trump is also concerned about what looks good on TV. He's like, I must look strong. We must look as though we're winning this war. He doesn't really care about strategy, okay? So because of this, it's very likely that he orders a land invasion of Iran because it would look good on TV, okay? So the problem with Zelensky is he cared about what looked good as opposed to actually what actually worked, okay? But you also have other problems, like you have extremists in the Ukrainian military, okay? And guys, these extremists, they're Nazis, they're neo-Nazis. And so the traditional understanding of Nazis are people who kill Jews, okay? But the Russians don't understand Nazis that way because remember, Germany and the Soviet Union fought this war. So the Russians understood Nazis to be enemies of Russia who want to kill Russians. And there were many neo-Nazis in Ukraine. They hate Russia. They want to kill as many Russians as possible. Okay? And they're the ones who are pushing for as much war as possible. Okay? So you have these extremists in the Ukrainian military. Okay? The last reason is NATO. So it's an open secret that NATO is helping the Ukrainian military against Russia. You have NATO military advisors devising strategy against Russia. Okay, so it's most likely that the summer offensive last summer was a NATO plan and not a Ukrainian plan. It's possible. We also know that NATO special forces are in the country directing missile strikes against Russian forces. Okay? Which means what? If this is true, and if Ukraine loses the war, meaning that it doesn't have enough soldiers to continue to fight this war, what will NATO do? Yeah. I mean, according to what happened to Vietnam War and the Athenian expedition against Sicily, it is most likely that the most likely outcome will be that NATO sends its own troops against Russia. Okay, so Macron of France have said that we want to send French soldiers, and the British Prime Minister has said that he is considering conscription for British people. Okay, which means that young British citizens will be drafted into the army to fight Russia. All right, so these are three historical examples that are very similar to what could happen in Iran. Okay, does that make sense, guys? All right, any questions before I continue? All right, is this clear so far? All right, now let's use another mode of analysis called game theory analysis, okay? And this is what I've been teaching you this semester. And the idea is that society, what happens in the real world, is a game among human beings. Okay, and each person is trying to play this game as to optimize the outcome for that person. Okay, so the question then is, why would the United States send 100,000 troops into Iran? So let's look at the individual motivations of the individual players, okay? So you have the United States. What does the United States want to do? What does it want to do? By doing what? And accomplishing what? It wants to topple the regime in Tehran, right?